A three-part video, and this is just part one on the second. Let's just go over these questions. What was the name of the first personal computer? Altair 8800, or Altair will be good enough. What year? 75. That's going to be important because I'm also going to ask you in this other one what year the internet was turned on. I want you to be able to tell me which came first. What was the technological innovation that made the PC possible? Microprocessor. He calls it the chip. Better word is microprocessor. Remember what it did? It took all those circuits, which were first on tubes and transistors, shrunk them down, thousands of them, onto one chip. What is meant by the term digital? Anybody get that? He actually used the term binary, yeah. Yeah, that's basically what it is. It's made up of ones and zeros. That's what digital means. And believe it or not, every computer communicates and processes only ones and zeros. So all the things you see on a computer, actually at the very bottom line, it's just ones and zeros being processed. Because all a computer knows is it off or is it on? 0, 1. And he uses combinations of those to make everything you see. What is a killer application? It's a software application that's so useful, you buy a PC just to use it. In other words, you're not the nerd buying the PC just to use the PC. You're buying the PC, you don't really need the computer. You want to use the software, which for the Altair, or for the, I guess it was for the PC, what was that software? VisiCalc or Spreadsheet, either one. So the killer application of the PC was the spreadsheet, or if you want to say VisiCalc, that was actually the brand name of that very first spreadsheet. I want to talk with you a little bit about how a PC works. Now this is very basic. You don't have to get too worried about all the terminology and everything, but I think everybody should have at least a basic understanding of how the computer hardware works. As the video said, these PCs are really just miniature versions in many ways of the big mainframe computers from the 50s and 60s and 70s. But everything's been miniaturized. There's a website called howstuffworks.com, and I'm going to have you read this as part of your assignment tonight. But I just thought what I'd do is go through one of the pages in there, list some of the different parts of the computer. And what I'm going to do is we're going to go through some of those right now. The main thing inside a computer, the number one thing probably need to know about, is what's called the CPU, or the Central Processing Unit, which is listed right up there at the top. That is actually the microprocessor, or the brains of the computer. What do you guys know the names of the companies that make PC microprocessors? What's the number one company probably? We visited it in the movie. Intel. And now there's another company that's out there cloning their chips, I suppose, or you could say developing their own chips, and that is AMD, right? So those are the two, and there's other companies that make microprocessors. But when you buy a PC, it's either going to have an Intel processor or a AMD processor. Now, before we even go any further, let's talk a little bit about the speed of a microprocessor. Has anybody in here built a computer recently? Oh, yes. In class yesterday. What was the speed of your microprocessor? Do you remember? 1 point what? All right, well, the key thing I wanted to get out of him is speed in microprocessors is measured in gigahertz these days. What does a gigahertz stand for? What does that mean? What does the term gigahertz mean? It's a good term to know because you hear these megahertz, gigahertz terms. All right, let's even go back. Just the term hertz, without worrying about car rentals. The term hertz means 1 cycle per second. So you think of it as a circuit being completed in a second. 1 hertz is a cycle per second. Now, when I was working in IT, most of our computers were in the megahertz. I remember we were excited at 100 megahertz. That processor's 100 megahertz. Wow. Okay. A megahertz, let's see if I can get this right now. Megahertz would be a million. No, thousand. Thousand, right? Does anybody know their Latin? Million? It is million. Because I know gigahertz is billion. So million cycles per second. Oh, kilohertz would be thousand. There, that's why I got it. Okay. So we have kilohertz, but megahertz is million cycles per second. So a gigahertz is billion cycles per second. So processors today run in the usually 2 to 3. I don't know if there's any 4. There might be some 4 gigahertz processors. billions of cycles per second. Now that's pretty incredible if you think about it. You have electrons running through silicon circuits billion times per second. What do you think is going to be one of the main problems when that happens? What's the main byproduct of that? Heat. So one of the biggest problems in making PCs faster is controlling the heat. If you think about it, if you have electrons running in there faster and faster and faster, it's going to melt the thing if you can't control the heat. So the way that they make these things so that they can not be so hot is they come up with different ways of cooling these computers. So when you open these things up, you're going to see fans. You guys all know about fans. All these computers have fans. Laptops have fans. But they also have heat sinks. A heat sink is just usually metal that's placed on top of the processor that absorbs the heat and dissipates it. But you're going to see fans. You're going to see heat sinks. So before I even go further on this, again with the processors, is how do you think they can make a processor go faster? What is the key thing you need to do to make a processor go faster? Any idea? In other words, how do they get from thousands to millions to billions? That's the correct answer. If the electron doesn't have to travel as far, it can do it faster, right? So one of the technologies, or one of the things that they've been doing to make these processors faster and faster is figuring out ways how they can etch these circuits smaller and smaller and smaller, down so they're basically the size of an electron. And so I used to work for Texas Instruments, and one of the things, we made chips there. We didn't make the microprocessors necessarily. We made other kinds of chips. And so every time they came out with a new version of a chip, they would talk about the size of the circuit. And the smaller it was meant the more efficient you were. Of course, you're going to get hotter when you do that too. So they keep shrinking these chips smaller and smaller and smaller to make them faster and faster. Well, at some point, you can't really keep shrinking it, right? At some point, there's no way to make it any smaller. And they've realized that. And the technologies to make it smaller are so expensive. But there's something else they're doing instead now. When you buy a computer chip now, those of you who have bought chips or bought computers lately, you've bought a dual core computer or a quad core. Does anybody know what that means? What does that mean? A quad core processor. What do you think that is? It's actually 4 processors on one chip. So all these new computers, I'm guessing, I'm not sure if this is a dual or a quad, this Mac, but all the new computers now, you're getting 2, 3, 4, 8 processors on one chip. So instead of shrinking the circuits, they're putting 2, 3, 4 processors on one chip. So in theory, you get 4 times the power. It doesn't quite work out that way because the software has to know how to make use of that. But you can see the problems is they're trying to figure out, they want to make them faster and smaller. All of this, the reason I'm telling you about all this stuff about making computers faster is you're going to be reading in your one of your articles tonight about Moore's Law. And you guys remember, maybe briefly, Gordon Moore was interviewed in the video. He was one of the founders of Intel. He was the CEO that had the office that didn't have a door on it, if you remember that little part in the video. He coined a phrase, or he created a term called Moore's Law. And the basic concept behind Moore's Law is that computing power doubles every 2 years at the same price point. So what that means is whatever the current speed is today, you know, laptops run what, $500 say for a new one, $700 for a Windows one at least. In 2 years, for that same price, you'll get one that's twice as powerful. That's Moore's Law. And if you think about it and you think back to the laptop you bought 2 or 3 years ago, or the one PC you bought 5 years before that, or whatever, you'll think it's roughly been doubling in power. The original Moore's Law was actually every 18 months. It's slowed down to every 2 years, but the concept is the same. Now, the implications of that are powerful, and we're not going to discuss those today, but when we get back into kind of the social side of computing, the impact of computers on the world, the fact that computing power for the same price point doubles every 2 years has a huge impact. Things that were considered the highest end today will be just normal in 2 years, and they'll be what everybody has 2 years after that. That's pretty amazing. I look at it this way. When I was writing an article for a magazine, I talked about, think about the poorest people in Africa. In 10 years, they will all probably have access to something that's like the best iPhone we have today. And you think about the implications of that. Now, that may not be exactly true, but the concept's the same, is what we consider kind of the high end, what everybody has today. or what the top of the line is today is what everybody's going to have in a few years. That changes everything. And so we'll talk about that when we get into social stuff and cultural things on computers. But I just want you to be thinking about that impact. Okay, so the CPUs, that's the brain behind the computer. It's the thing that processes everything. The data goes in, it gets processed, it comes out. Memory is the next thing I want to talk to you about. When you buy a computer, you always do two things usually. There are three things. You want to know how fast the processor is, you want to know how much memory it has, and how big the hard disk is. Those are kind of the things that kind of help you decide what your computer is going to be. And maybe for some people, the graphics is important too. So memory. When it comes to memory, memory is the working storage of the computer. So for instance, when you turn a computer on and it boots up and it loads the software and it starts running programs, it puts those programs into memory so you can quickly access them. I like to think of what they call memory here, what we usually refer to as RAM, random access memory, as the short-term memory of the computer. It's sort of like you guys, when somebody says something to you, and they say, repeat back to me, you can repeat it back to them right away, right? Because it's in your short-term memory. You immediately have access to it. RAM is important because everything that you see on the screen, everything that you're working with in the computer has to be loaded into that memory in order for the computer to work properly. Now again, I'm being very general here. I'm not getting into all the specifics of how memory management works on a computer. But if you think about it, when you turn your computer on and I'm looking at the one here in front of me, I have a web browser loaded, I have Windows 7 loaded. Those are in memory right now so that I can use it and quickly access it. It's very fast, but when I turn the computer off, whatever's in memory gets lost, right? If I don't save it to the hard disk, it's gone. So think of RAM as short-term memory. The motherboard is next. The motherboard is the main circuit board in a computer. When you open these things up, there's going to be one big circuit board attached to it, physically attached. That's the motherboard. This is what a motherboard will look like, and it's pointing out some other things. But think about this. The motherboard is the bridge between everything else on the computer, okay? The microprocessor goes on it. The memory goes on it. It has places for other things to connect, including this SATA is where the hard disk would connect to it. Okay, so everything connects into it. So you can think of it as the main circuit board of the computer. Power supply. When you plug a computer into the wall, it plugs into the back, and there's usually some sort of, you can see it if you've got the back of it to you, there's a place for the plug to go in. When you open your computer, on the other side of that is going to be a metal box, sometimes with a fan in it. That's a power supply. What that does is it takes the power you're pulling in from the wall or from the electricity company, and it distributes it to all the parts of the computer. Everything needs power. The motherboard needs power, the hard disk needs power, sometimes different graphics cards and things need power, the DVD drive needs power, they all need power. So its job is to take and distribute power. Depending on the computer you've got, it may have a very high-end power supply or a very low-end power supply. I built a computer for myself a few years ago, and I was thinking about making it a gaming PC because I got kids. I thought, well, let's see, maybe I can go get this graphics card that's a little bit nicer, and then they can play, the games will look a lot nicer. And I went up to the counter and told the guy, I think I want to get this. He goes, well, you're going to need a new power supply if you get that. And all of a sudden, the $50 card was going to be another $100 in power supply, and I didn't do it. I know I'm a bad father, right, because I wouldn't do it. But the idea, though, is that you need a power supply that's equivalent to all the different things on your computer. The more power that it draws, the higher the power supply needs to be, the bigger it needs to be. The other things that I'll talk to you about, we don't really need to go into some of these. It's interesting, these parts that it lists, like a sound card and a graphics card, most motherboards include those on the motherboard. When you open it up, you'll see that the ports for the graphics, the video, okay, the monitor, or the plug for the sound are actually attached right to the motherboard. When you build a PC now, you can just get a motherboard that has all those things on it. But for those of you that are into gaming, you probably also know you need high-end graphics, which was my experience when I was looking for my sons. So you buy a separate graphics card. Most of the time, it has its own microprocessor dedicated just to graphics processing. So you'll, depending on the machine you have, you may have different sorts of graphics. Okay, so I told you RAM is like short-term memory, right? Anything you load, anything you do is pulled up into that memory. It's the working storage of the computer. But when you need to save something for long-term, you save it to the hard disk, drive C. If you're using Windows, it's usually labeled drive C. If you're using a Mac, it's usually Mac hard disk or Macintosh hard disk or something like that. And that is the long-term storage. Generally, a hard disk is actually a disk. Why are they called disks? You look at them in here, you're just going to see these metal boxes. But if you open one of them up, you'll see inside are these little disks that spin. And they're magnetic. So they have little magnetic-like needles that read and write from them. And they can be fast or slow, and they will slow down your computer if they're not very fast. Most of the time, the bigger the hard disk, the slower, though not always. Now, I'm not an expert on some of this hardware stuff, but I'm trying to give you just kind of the basics. Okay, so I want you to be able to identify a processor, a motherboard, a hard disk, RAM. What else did I say? Power supply. And then if it has it, it's a floppy drive. Did anybody use a floppy drive in here? A few of you have used the floppy drive. They are called floppy drives. They're the little 3.5-inch disks that actually aren't very floppy. They're just little disks about like that. It's called a floppy drive because before that we used 5.25-inch disks, which were bigger, and you could hold them like this and flop them and they'd go up and down. And before that, I think they were 8-inch disks. That was before my time. But when I first started using computers, it was 5.25-inch, these black disks about that big. And there were no hard disks in the PCs I first used. You would just put these floppy disks in. So what do I want you to know about hardware? It's one of the components of an information system. It's the physical, tangible part of an information system. Actually, the architecture hasn't changed that much in years. So it's the ones we buy today, though generally smaller, pretty much are set up the same inside. But the key things to know is I want you to be able to know what a processor is, the microprocessor, which is the reason we can get a computer to work today. So know what it is. It's the brains behind the computer. It's measured in gigahertz, the speed. What RAM is, okay, the short-term memory. What the hard disk does. The purpose of the hard disk is the long-term storage. And power supply and motherboard. And all of those things will be in your reading. So if you're kind of like, well, whoa, we just went through that really quick. You'll have a reading assignment tonight, again, where you can look at that. They even have a video on there if you want to take a video of the inside of a computer. Microprocessor, the RAM, the memory, the hard disk. If you can identify some of these different components.